Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to each of you for being here. You work in an area that's heavily dependent on technology, and the technology that you address has an intimate relationship with 300+ million Americans. It's important that we continue to have technological innovation. In your area in particular, innovation is heavily dependent on the availability of spectrum. We know that spectrum is in a lot of hands. It's especially in the hands of a lot of federal government agencies. The federal government and its various agencies and departments owns a lot, not just a lot of spectrum categorically, but it owns a lot of spectrum that's of the especially valuable sort, what you might call beachfront property, the sort that's really useful to a lot of people. And yet we know that there's kind of some problem with this. Unlike a private actor, unlike an individual or a corporation whose business it is to ensure that they're using their spectrum in the most efficient possible manner, the government doesn't necessarily act that way. And that's okay. We understand that. We don't expect governments to act necessarily in the same way that private actors will. But just the same, in order to make sure that we're using it effectively and efficiently, we need to know what it's worth. We need to have some type of valuation. Now, that's why I introduced a bill called the Government Spectrum Valuation Act. This bill, if passed into law today, would do nothing to actually move the spectrum. It would simply require an appraisal of sorts, a valuation of what it is that the government owns, where it owns it, and what it's worth. It's a bill calling for a study and for more data so that we can understand what the opportunity costs are for the federal government owning this much beachfront property, so to speak. Mr. O'Reilly, I'll start with you. Given that spectrum is a finite, limited resource, do you think it's important for Congress to have access to data about the value of the spectrum that it holds and to identify inefficiencies that might exist in the spectrum allocations?
Absolutely, and I support your bill wholeheartedly.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. And I appreciate you getting right to the point on that. and the type of data being sought in this bill, which includes the identification of opportunity costs, do you believe that that in particular is a useful tool toward helping Congress and federal agencies figure out how to allocate spectrum?
Yes, I do believe we have to, that is a first step in the equation. The second step is how do you use that data to then make a decision at your level on how to free particular bands. And I'll give you one band, for example, 3.45 to 3.55. We were led to believe, multiple conversations were had that 100 megahertz was going to come from the Department of Defense to the FCC to make it commercially available. And that decision has since changed. And now we're doing a feasibility study whether it can be shared, which is much different than making 100 megahertz of prime mid-band spectrum available for commercial purposes. Shared spectrum is valuable too, and it has its place, but here's a band that has changed behavior based on something I can't describe what happened. And I think if you had a valuation of what that piece is worth, I think that would be critical for decision makers to be able to go forward.
Mr. Carr, would you agree that having access to this kind of information would be helpful to Congress and federal agencies?
Thank you, Senator. I agree with you. We shouldn't be flying blind when it comes to decisions about those assets. If the government has $30 billion worth of assets in a warehouse, or it has $500 billion worth of assets in a warehouse, you all should be able to know that to make informed decisions about what to do with it.
Ms. Rosenworcel?
Yes, absolutely. We need a uniform system of valuation, and once we have one, we need to develop incentives so those federal actors can see some gain and not just loss from reallocation for new commercial use.
Mr. Starks?
I would agree as well, Senator. It certainly sounds like a proposal that needs to be executed here in getting a better understanding of what the value of this is holistically so that we can make the right decisions in real time.
Thank you. Chairman Pai, I'm going to ask you to answer the same question, and at the same time, I want you to describe for me what the digital divide is, what it means when we talk about closing the digital divide.
I appreciate the question, Senator. I want to join my colleagues in advocating for your approach, and I think it actually dovetails quite nicely with the FCC's determination to make spectrum decisions in this area that are based on sound engineering. So if we can get the economics right, if we can get the engineering right, I have a feeling the policy and politics will take care of themselves. To me, at least, the digital divide means people not having the access necessary to be able to educate their kids, to do telemedicine, to engage in precision agriculture, to start a business, to do all the other great things that broadband affords. And I saw that when I was recently in your state, visited Moab, where I got to see a telemedicine application, remotely connected with a school in far southern Utah that is just clinging on to access. And when you see what it means to these kids who are in a school that it has just 8 students, to be able to gain access to the internet and learn at the same pace and at the same level as their counterparts in Moab, that's a big game changer. And to me, that's why closing the digital divide has to be our national mission.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask him a simple yes or no question on a follow-up? I promise to be very brief. Sure. Does that include, when we talk about the digital divide, you referred to all those uses, does it include entertainment, or should it, properly under the statute, include access to entertainment?
Yes, and any type of application that broadband would allow.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.